Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the Advanced Creative Writing course for City Lit. And this is, again, our continuing experiment with the advanced course is that rather than set up a series of programmed lectures each week, we're trying to respond to individual interest in the course of the term. And I'll be posting, 2 or 3 new videos each term, which I'll ideally keep on the program and make available to future students to either learn from or to laugh at, depending on how well these turn out. Again, we're going to be a little more informal, and I'm not going to be preparing lectures so much as simply replying to some discussions that we've been having. The discussions that one of the points that came up this week was the term, what is an omniscient narrator, and what is an omniscient point of view. I'm going to give you my fairly strong opinions about the term omniscient point of view or omniscient narrator. It's a term that's very often used in creative writing courses, and it is used in many creative writing textbooks. You'll notice we don't use creative writing textbooks in this class, and I never use them. I think the creative writing textbook is good writing. That is what we learn from. And the omniscient narrator comes up all the time in classes, and my students are often asking me about it, and they often told about it in creative writing courses. And I think this is one big bone I have to pick with creative writing courses, is I personally think we should take the term omniscient narrator and throw it out the window. It's not a term that has a lot of validity in the way fiction works that I can tell, but it's a term that was sort of conjured up years and years ago to discuss certain writers, particularly Henry James. I'll try to get him in the picture here. Henry James, the American. I'll just pick this at random off the shelf. The notion of the fly on the wall perspective in the novel. There was certainly a lot wider angle to the novel in the early 18th and 19th centuries. We did have a larger, sometimes more panoramic vision of the society the characters were in. We didn't have as much of a close third person that we have in many of the contemporary novels that we read. But still, it's still an ineffective term to me. I mean, for example, I just took this off the shelf at random, The American by Henry James. And that's a fairly close third person, a guy named, Christopher Newman, as I recall. It's pretty much seeing the world through his vantage. But in many of James's novels, we do have a much more amorphous sense of point of view. They're often very confusing novels, by the way. Novels such as The Wings of the Dove and The Golden Bowl. And some of these later novels, which do really, they're very difficult books to read when you have any sort of omniscient-like narrator. So the first thing that I'll keep sending you back to the books you enjoy reading are not going to have much that looks like an omniscient narrator in them. The omniscient narrator isn't used. I will, again, argue this with most creative writing teachers. I don't believe it's used. Point of view and the vantage of your book is 90% of what your readers follow and makes the book sensible to them. It's not, as we keep saying, it's not a writer or a narrator telling them lots of information. There is often a narrative voice. There's often different ways of using point of view. I keep sending you back to close third person, as in most of the stories we're reading in this class and the novels we're reading. You may have a point of view shift around, and we'll talk about that. But let's look back at where some of these notions of an omniscient narrator come from. Here's an early novel, Tom Jones, very funny book. It's one of the classics that we still read. And there's a narrator voice in this who's telling us the story of good Tom and how Tom was such a noble young man. And it's a comic voice for Henry Fielding, because the narrative voice in it is often talking, as I recall, talking about all these good people and how Tom really wanted to do the best in life and was a good boy and so forth. And all the time the narrative voice is telling us what the book is about. Tom Jones is off, sleeping with anyone he can and, making a mess of everything and screwing things up. And he's not really living according to the ideals of this narrative voice. Again, you might consider that an almost omniscient narrator, and you will see it more commonly in books by people who are 200 years dead. We aren't 200 years dead. We're alive. We're writing living novels. You could certainly do pastiches, as I have, of older forms, and lots of contemporary writers will do pastiches of older forms of writing. But again, this is the sort of stuff you would do with your third, fourth, fifth novel, probably. And in your first novels and your first stories, you're going to learn the basic bread and butter techniques. Bleak House. This is my first edition of Bleak House. Oh, by the way, I thought I was going to show you my dog. There's my dog. So this is something you get in advance course. You get to see my dog, this is Bleak House, the first edition. Half of this book is told in terms of a kind of omniscient narrator who's traveling through London and seeing all the different classes and how they live, and the lonely poor boy living on the street corner, and the wealthy people up in their castle, and it moves through through the legal channels and the legal institutions and so forth. And these chapters in Bleak House are the closest to an omniscient narrator that I can think of, where you're actually moving through the city. But again, it's not omniscient. The term omniscient is a very confusing term. Omniscient, all-knowing, knows everything. This technique is a very difficult one to pull off. And again, it's why I warn you not to do it. It still comes in and focuses on individual characters. It follows them through lives. It doesn't jump all over the place and tell us lots of information. It's usually in time, so we follow these characters in time, and a narrative time, through scenes and so forth. You'll also see that half of this book is told first person, Esther Summerfield, and those sections are much easier to read because we know who's telling the story, we know who's experiencing the story. So there's the closest to an example. Again, it's from a couple hundred years ago. Wonderful novel. I would certainly recommend reading it. I wouldn't recommend to read it to master that form of point of view, because that is an outdated one. Here's one interesting point of view. I was thinking of omniscient narratives. If on a winter's night, a traveler, and it's a very funny Calvino novel in which we're actually watching a book as it's happening, and it's being written by the author, and there's a sort of authorial presence in the background, and there's a game being played. It's the most omniscient narrator I can think of, and it's a late Calvino novel. It's a fun Calvino novel, and it's not the novel you're going to write the first time out of the box, maybe the 10th time out of the box, as Calvino does. It's an experiment, and it's a fairly enjoyable experiment. Here's the closest to kind of an old-fashioned kind of Victorian novel which tries to cover large sections of the world. Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections. He'll go into long discussions in his books about cities and how they're formed and they're developed. And he'll do in his last book, Freedom, there'll be long sections about eco-catastrophes and eco-threats to our environment. But they will still be coming through the interests of the characters in those sections of the book. So they're not omniscient again. But we will move through various characters. For example, in The Corrections, we'll start off with one person's point of view for a long section of the book, and then we'll move to the sisters, and then we'll move to the mothers and the father who has Alzheimer's. And each section will be told from the point of view of a different character. But again, that's not omniscient. Each of those sections is true to the perspective of its character. So be looking for these things. Our Man in Havana, we're reading that this term, and in possibly future terms. It's a wonderful, funny novel. And it's in a more advanced masterclass in point of view shifts. Now we're getting into more, conventional narratives. So we have a fairly close third person with Wormold in this book. But we also start to shift around. We pull back. There's some of those scenes that the spies are talking in London, and we're way back from our characters, and we are almost looking at them from the ceiling in some of those scenes. We just hear them coming and going, and we're not really going in with the character. But in most of those scenes, even then, you will be with one of the characters more than another one. So it's not really omniscient, as people would like to say. Again, I can't think of omniscient is knowing everything and knowing all things, and the pleasure of a novel or fiction is we only know what our characters know. We're experiencing things as they happen through our characters. There's lots of ways to do that. And again, while we're reading, Graham Greene plays around with point of view. He shifts quite a few times in this. We start with Wormold very early, and then we go way back from him. And he's almost a minor character in some of the scenes from other people's perspectives. This is a fairly experimental novel. As easy and fun as it is to read, he's playing with point of view. I always say go back to the early books, and here's 21 Stories, which contains many of Graham Greene's shortest and earliest stories, and you will see him using much more conventional, close, third-person point of view. When he shifts point of view, he shifts in all the very clear and conventional ways, so we know who we're with, and we see scenes through them. When we shift point of view several times in a story, that's shifting point of view. That's not omniscient point of view. So omniscient point of view is a term that's often used. I don't know why, and I don't know why people talk about it as much as they do. I'm simply mentioning it as a thing to watch out for. I often find that students use omniscient point of view as an excuse for telling everything they shouldn't be telling us. And they say, oh, I'm being omniscient, I'm using an omniscient point of view. But that's really a bit of a cop-out, I think. I think you've got to keep reading these books you're reading. That's where you're going to learn this basic technique of fiction, is just by reading good writers. And as some of you have mentioned, sometimes the writers who are said to be good aren't very good writers. They're not good at point of view. They're not good at narrative storytelling. They're good at talking about big issues or big stories or big societal things, or cultural, social issues. But they're not really telling the story. So you got to learn to start distinguishing between techniques and content of stories. All right, so that's everything I have to say about omniscient narrative, omniscient point of view. My main thing is just stay away from it. Don't touch it. It's like a snake in the park. Just don't touch it. It's something you might want to play with down the line. Once you've learned all the basic techniques, you can start playing a lot with fiction. But that's way down the line. And you'll see most writers start to make these more experimental novels later in their careers. Okay, so great. Keep writing every day. I hope this worked out all right. I'm using a different system here than I did in the past, a more informal system. And again, you can say goodbye to my dog. Anyway, there's Misty. Look up. Say goodbye. Say goodbye. Okay. She's the one that's barking sometimes when I'm trying to make these videos. Anyway, we'll talk to you all soon.